Backslide The Prequil. The Emerald Veil by Alan T. Cunningham. Prologue Dublin, 1972. The first time Mary Porter saw Patrick Byrne, he was standing outside a smoke-filled pub on Grafton Street, collar turned up against the rain. She noticed his eyes before anything else, watchful, sharp, the kind of eyes that seemed to measure a person's soul before they spoke a word. Mary thought she was watching a man alone. In truth, she was watching a man surrounded. And perhaps, in a way, she had. Chapter 1: Arrival. The train rattled across the River Liffey just as the rain began, a soft mist at first, then sheets of silver that blurred the gas lamps along the quay. Mary Porter pressed her forehead to the glass and tried to see through it, but Dublin was a watercolor of smudged grays and dripping shadows. The city seemed to wear its sorrow openly, and yet there was a pulse to it that caught in her chest. She had only been in Ireland a week, but already the air felt heavier here. Conversations hushed when soldiers passed by in armored trucks. Posters curled on the walls shouted slogans she barely understood, while the news crackled nightly with bombings, raids, and retaliations. Her supervisor at Trinity had warned her to be cautious, to stay in her boarding house after dark, but Mary never had much patience for being told where she could and couldn't go. Curiosity was part of her nature. It was why she'd chosen psychiatry, why she'd pursued research into the mind's hidden corridors, and perhaps why she now found herself walking alone through the wet cobblestones of Grafton Street. The pub at the corner glowed amber against the gloom, its windows clouded with smoke and laughter. Music spilled out when the door opened, a fiddle keeping time with voices thick with Guinness. Mary hesitated. She wasn't supposed to go inside. Her professor had been clear about that, but she lingered all the same, half concealed by her umbrella, drawn by the warmth of the scene. That was when she saw him. A man stood in the doorway, collar turned up, cigarette burning between steady fingers. He was tall, shoulders squared, with a presence that made the space around him seem taut, like a wire drawn too tight. His eyes were the first thing she noticed. Dark, searching, restless. They moved constantly, scanning the street, then settling on her for an instant that felt longer than it should. Mary looked away quickly, embarrassed at being caught staring. But she felt something, not recognition exactly, more like a shiver of memory. As if she'd seen him before, in a dream that had dissolved with the dawn. She told herself it was nonsense. He was just another Irishman keeping out of the rain. But as she crossed the street, she felt his gaze linger, heavy as the mist that clung to her coat. Later, she would learn his name. Later, she would discover the secrets he carried and the dangerous game he played with lives and loyalties. Patrick Byrne was not just IRA, not just MI5, not just CIA, but all of them at once, feeding each master enough lies to keep himself alive. But that night, he was only a stranger in the rain, a pair of eyes that stirred something deep in her chest. And though she didn't know it yet, the path she stepped onto would burn through both their lives like fire. Chapter 2: Boarding House. The next morning, Dublin felt raw, washed clean, but unsettled, like the city hadn't yet decided whether to breathe easy or brace for another blow. Mary walked briskly down Nassau Street toward Trinity, her umbrella tucked under her arm, the air damp enough to curl her hair. She had just passed the bookshop when a voice, low and steady, reached her ear. "You shouldn't stare at strangers in the rain." Mary turned. He was leaning against the brickwork, cigarette burning between two fingers, collar still turned up. His eyes, those same restless eyes, met hers with a half-smile that was more challenge than greeting. "I wasn't starring," she said, a little too quickly. He exhaled smoke and tilted his head. "No, then I'll take it as luck, running into you again." Mary adjusted the strap of her satchel, forcing herself not to glance away. Dublin's a small city. "Smaller than you think." His tone was casual, but there was an edge beneath it, like a blade wrapped in cloth. She hesitated. Her supervisor's warning, "Keep to yourself, don't linger, don't ask questions," pressed at the back of her mind. Yet something in Patrick's presence tugged at her curiosity. He was dangerous, yes, but also magnetic in a way that made her feel as though she'd stepped into someone else's story. "Do you always wait outside bookshops for strangers?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Only the interesting ones. He flicked his cigarette to the pavement, crushing it beneath his boot. Let me buy you a cup of tea. Mary almost laughed. It was so ordinary an offer, and yet nothing about him felt ordinary. I don't even know your name. He extended his hand. Patrick Byrne. She didn't take it right away. Mary Porter. His smile deepened, as if he'd already known. So now we're not strangers. Mary should have walked on, gone straight to the safety of Trinity's gates, but instead she found herself nodding. All right, 1 cup of tea. And as they turned down the side street together, she knew, with the same certainty that had gripped her the night before, that nothing about this was chance. The cafe was narrow, tucked between a tobacconist and a pawnshop. Its windows steamed with condensation, and the air smelled of damp wool and strong tea. Patrick chose a table in the corner, his back to the wall, the way a soldier or a criminal might. Mary sat opposite him, feeling the weight of his gaze even as she unwound her scarf. You're not Irish, he said once the tea arrived. No, she replied, stirring sugar into her cup. I'm here for research at Trinity. He raised an eyebrow. Research into what? Psychiatry, dreams, memory, how the mind hides what it doesn't want to face. She met his eyes deliberately. And what about you? Patrick smiled faintly, as if amused by the symmetry of her question. I'm in imports and exports. Mary let out a soft laugh. That sounds deliberately vague. Vagueness is underrated, keeps people guessing. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. And you should be careful what you tell strangers in a city like this. Her pulse quickened. Are you warning me or threatening me? Neither. His smile never faltered. Call it advice. Dublin has ears, and you never know whose side someone's on. Mary studied him, searching for a crack in his composure. His face gave little away, but his eyes, always moving, always scanning, betrayed something else, vigilance born of habit or fear. Then why invite me here? She asked softly. Patrick didn't answer immediately. He lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and set it down with care. Because you looked at me like you already knew me, and I wanted to know why. Mary's throat went dry. She thought of the strange flicker of recognition she'd felt the night before, the dreamlike sense of memory. Maybe I remind you of someone, she said. Or maybe you remind me of myself, he murmured. The words hung between them, heavy as the rain against the windows. Mary forced a smile, but she felt the ground shifting beneath her. This was no chance meeting, no harmless cup of tea. Patrick Byrne was a man with secrets, and whether she liked it or not, she had just stepped inside them. The words still lingered in the air when the bell over the cafe door jangled. Mary glanced up to see a young boy, no more than 12, shuffle inside, dripping rainwater onto the tiled floor. He carried a bundle of newspapers under one arm, but instead of calling out the headlines like the other paperboys, he moved straight to Patrick's table. Without a word, the boy slid a folded scrap of paper across the table and left again, the bell chiming behind him. Mary blinked. Friend of yours. Patrick barely looked at her as he unfolded the note. His expression didn't change, but Mary noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers stilled just a second too long on the page. Then he tucked it into his coat pocket, calm as if it were nothing more than a shopping list. Delivery service, he said smoothly. But Mary wasn't convinced. Something in his stillness unsettled her more than any sudden movement might have. What kind of delivery service? She pressed. Patrick leaned back, his eyes narrowing just slightly, though the smile stayed fixed. The kind that doesn't concern you. For a moment, silence pressed down between them, broken only by the clatter of crockery and the hiss of the kettle behind the counter. Mary felt the urge to retreat, to gather her things and leave before she was dragged into whatever shadowed business this man lived in. And yet she didn't. Instead, she lifted her chin. You're not what you say you are. Patrick studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a short laugh, genuine this time, low and rough. Neither are you, Miss Porter, not really. Before she could answer, the bell rang again. This time, it wasn't a boy but 2 men in overcoats, their eyes scanning the cafe. One of them brushed rain from his hat, the other kept his hand inside his coat pocket. Patrick's voice dropped, soft and urgent. Time to go. He was on his feet before Mary could process it, his hand light on her elbow as he guided her toward the back door. Mary's heart thudded. She wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, but instead she found herself moving with him, as though her body had already decided what her mind hadn't. Out in the rain-soaked alley, Patrick finally released her arm. You should forget this morning ever happened, he said, his eyes sharp in the half-light. And if I do, she asked. His smile returned, colder this time. Then you'll see more of me than you should. And before she could reply, he vanished into the mist, leaving Mary alone with the echo of his warning and the undeniable truth that her life in Dublin had just taken a dangerous turn. Chapter 3, Trinity College. The library's long hall always reminded Mary of a church, its oak shelves rising like pillars, the scent of old paper clinging to the air like incense. Normally, the silence soothed her. Today, it pressed down, oppressive, as if every whisper of a turned page belonged to someone watching her. She tried to read, but her hands betrayed her, fingers trembling against the parchment. The image of Patrick Byrne loomed behind every line of text, his voice low, steady, too knowing. The boy with the folded note, the men in overcoats, and the way he had guided her through the back door as if she were already part of his story. She should have been afraid. She should have gone straight back to Mrs. O'Shea's boarding house, locked her door, and written her supervisor for an early return to London. Instead, she felt drawn. Curiosity coiled inside her like a wire, sharp and insistent. Miss Porter. The voice snapped her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Professor Wallace standing by her desk, his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was grave, though his tone was quiet enough not to disturb the students nearby. A word, if you please. Mary gathered her books and followed him through the hushed corridors to his office. The blinds were half drawn against the weak morning light, throwing the room into shadow. Wallace gestured for her to sit, then lowered himself heavily into the chair opposite. You've been here scarcely a week, he began, and already I hear whispers. Mary frowned. Whispers. About the company you keep. His eyes fixed on her, sharp behind the lenses of his glasses. Dublin is not London, Miss Porter. Here every stranger is noticed. Every conversation is marked, and curiosity, he leaned forward slightly, curiosity can get you killed. Mary's throat went dry. I don't know what you mean. Wallace's gaze didn't waver. Don't play the innocent. A man like Patrick Byrne does not happen to people. He finds them, he uses them, and once he does, the best you can hope for is distance. The name struck her like a bell. She hadn't spoken it aloud, not once, yet here it was, heavy on Wallace's tongue, as if the whole city already knew what she was trying not to admit. Stay away from him, Wallace said, his voice low and hard now. Whatever he tells you, whatever mask he wears, it's lies. For your own safety, Miss Porter, you will forget him. Mary sat in silence, her fingers knotted in her lap. She wanted to promise she'd do exactly that. She wanted to believe she could. But even as she nodded, part of her knew she wouldn't. Mary left Wallace's office with her heart thudding in her chest. The corridors of Trinity seemed narrower than before, the faces of passing students sharper, more suspicious. She told herself the warning had been enough, that she would walk back to the boarding house, close the curtains, and bury herself in books until Dublin was nothing but a rain-soaked memory. Outside, the afternoon drizzle had thickened into steady rain. She pulled her coat tight and crossed Front Square toward the gates, each footstep echoing on the slick stones. Wallace's words replayed in her mind. A man like Patrick Byrne does not happen to people. He finds them. At the main gate, she paused beneath the archway. The street beyond was busy with bicycles, horse carts, students darting for cover under umbrellas. And yet, she froze. Across the street, beneath the awning of a tobacconist's, a figure stood with his collar turned up against the rain. Smoke curled from a cigarette in his hand. His eyes were hidden in shadow, but she didn't need to see them to know. Patrick Byrne. He didn't move toward her. He didn't raise a hand or call her name. He simply stood there as if his very presence was a message. I'm still here. I always will be. Mary's stomach knotted. She stepped quickly into the crowd, telling herself not to look back, not to give him the satisfaction. But halfway down the street, she faltered. She turned her head. The awning was empty. Only rain, only shadows. Mary walked faster, her breath catching. Wallace had told her to forget him, but how do you forget someone who won't let you? Chapter 4: The Safe House. Patrick Byrne trusted very little in Dublin. Not the rain that could mask footsteps, not the laughter in a pub that might hide listening ears, and certainly not the men waiting for him in the safe house on Grafton Street. He pushed the door open with a knuckle and stepped inside. The room smelled of coal smoke and damp plaster. A single bulb swung overhead, casting yellow light over two figures at the table. One wore the weary arrogance of an IRA man, leather jacket, cheap cigarettes, jaw tight with zeal. The other was leaner, sharper, with the polished shoes and clipped vowels of London. Patrick didn't sit until he'd scanned the corners, the windows, the door. Then he lowered himself into the chair, calm as a priest at confession. "You're late," the IRA man said. Patrick drew out a cigarette and lit it. "I was followed." That silenced them both for a moment. The London man leaned forward, voice quiet but cutting. "By whom?" Patrick exhaled smoke, his face unreadable. "A girl, Trinity student, English." The IRA man scoffed. "Then she's nothing." "She's not nothing," the Londoner countered. His gaze flicked to Patrick. "The wrong word in the wrong ear and your little balancing act collapses. Cut her loose before she cuts you open." Patrick said nothing. He thought of Mary Porter's curious eyes, the way she had stared at him as though she already knew him, the way she hadn't run when she should have. Finally, he stubbed out his cigarette. "Leave her to me." The IRA man smirked. "That's what I'm afraid of." Patrick rose, his coat collar pulled high and left them to their suspicions. Out in the rain again, he felt the city close around him. Damp stone, wet streets, hidden rifles in doorways. And somewhere, not far from here, Mary Porter was walking straight into the fire without even knowing it. Patrick took another cigarette from his pocket but didn't light it. His hands were steady, but his mind was. He should let her go. He wouldn't. Chapter 5: The Letter. The boarding house was quiet when Mary returned that evening. Too quiet. Usually the hallways buzzed faintly with the sounds of students, a wireless crackling upstairs, laughter drifting from the kitchen, footsteps on the narrow staircase. Tonight, silence pressed against the walls like something alive. Mrs. O'Shea barely looked up as Mary hung her coat. The landlady sat stiffly at the table, a rosary wound tight around her fingers, lips moving in silent prayer. Mary thought of asking what was wrong, but the older woman's eyes warned her away. Upstairs, Mary unlocked her door and pushed it open. The first thing she noticed was the smell, tobacco smoke, faint but fresh. Her books lay neatly on the desk, her notes stacked where she'd left them. But there, on top of her papers, was something new, a single envelope unmarked. Mary's throat tightened. She crossed the room slowly, every nerve alert, and picked it up. Inside was a folded sheet of plain paper. On it, in careful, slanted handwriting, were just 4 words. "Stay away from me." No name, no signature, but she knew. Patrick Byrne had been in her room. Mary sank onto the edge of her bed, the paper trembling in her hands. She should be furious. She should be terrified. But beneath the fear, beneath the invasion of it, was something she couldn't explain, a pull, as if the warning were not meant to sever their connection, but to tighten it. In the silence, she could almost hear his voice. "Leave now before it's too late." But Mary Porter had never been good at turning away from locked doors, and Patrick Byrne was the darkest door she had ever found. Chapter 6: The Alley. The rain had stopped, leaving the street slick and gleaming under the dim gas lamps. Mary's umbrella swung lazily at her side, more a prop than protection. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the words from the note Patrick had left. "Stay away from me." She shouldn't be here. She knew it. Trinity's corridors, the boarding house, even the cafes she used to frequent now felt suffocating. But curiosity had a stubborn way of overriding caution, and tonight it led her to a narrow alley behind Grafton Street. She paused at the mouth of the alley. Shadows clung to the brick walls like smoke. And there he was, leaning casually against the far wall, cigarette in hand, collar turned up, as though he had been waiting for her all along. "You didn't stay away," he said softly, almost amused. Mary's stomach tightened. "I couldn't." Patrick flicked the ash from his cigarette, eyes scanning the street behind her. "Dangerous answer," he said. Then, more quietly, "You don't understand what you're stepping into." "Try me," Mary said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. For a long moment, he regarded her, as if weighing her soul against the risks she would never comprehend. Finally, he exhaled and flicked the cigarette down into the wet cobblestones. "Curiosity kills," he murmured, "and sometimes it draws fire." Before Mary could respond, the alley's quiet was broken by a shout, footsteps echoing against the walls. Patrick's expression hardened. "Move!" he ordered, and grabbed her arm, pulling her deeper into the shadows. Two men rounded the corner, eyes sweeping the alley. Patrick slipped a hand into his coat, a flash of metal catching the lamplight, then the figures hesitated and passed, uncertain. Mary's heart raced. Who were they? "Friends you don't want to meet," he said. His voice was calm, but the sharp edge beneath it made her blood run cold. "And they're not the only ones." For the first time, Mary truly saw him. Not the stranger in the rain, not the charming mystery of the cafe, but a man entangled in a web of danger that she could feel brushing against her own life. "Why me?" she asked, barely a whisper. Patrick's eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. "Because you're already here," he said. Then, almost reluctantly, he let go of her arm. "Be careful, Mary. Curiosity isn't the only thing that will get you killed." She watched him melt into the night, a shadow among shadows, leaving her alone in the alley with her pulse racing and the undeniable truth. She was in over her head, and she had known it the moment she saw his eyes. Chapter 7. Shadows on Nassau Street. The morning after the alley encounter, Dublin seemed almost peaceful, a deceptive calm, as if the city were holding its breath. Mary tried to concentrate on her research, but every sound outside her window made her flinch. The clatter of boots on cobblestones, the hum of a passing lorry. The faint murmur of voices, in an unfamiliar dialect. Her boarding house felt smaller than ever, its walls pressing in, as if aware she had wandered too close to a world she didn't belong in. By mid-afternoon, Mary decided to walk through Nassau Street. Hopping movement might clear her head. She kept to the sidewalks, eyes flicking to every passerby, umbrella clutched like a shield. Then she saw it, a flash of movement, a figure across the street, tall, collar turned up, cigarette in hand. Patrick Byrne. He didn't approach, he didn't wave. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. Mary's pulse quickened. Part of her wanted to cross the street and demand answers. Another part wanted to turn and flee, retreating to the false safety of her books and quiet rooms. Before she could decide, a deafening crash echoed from the next block, a storefront window shattered, glass scattering across the wet cobblestones. People screamed, ducking or running. Smoke and the acrid smell of fire rose in a haze. Patrick moved instantly, slipping into the chaos like he belonged there, his presence magnetic and lethal. Mary froze for a heartbeat too long, then realized she had no choice but to follow him, drawn as much by instinct as by fear. Chapter 8. Eyes in the Crowd. Mary didn't sleep well that night. The sounds of Dublin, distant shouts, the clatter of late-night carts, the occasional siren threaded through her dreams like warnings. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Patrick in the alley, calm and untouchable, and she felt the pull of a life she wasn't meant to touch. By mid-morning, she forced herself out of the boarding house, telling herself she needed the routine of Trinity to feel safe. But safety had become a fragile illusion. As she crossed Grafton Street, a chill ran down her spine. People passed by in all directions, umbrellas held high, coats pulled tight. And yet, among the crowd, she noticed a man she hadn't seen before, overcoat, hat pulled low, eyes flicking to her with unnerving precision. Mary's stomach knotted. She quickened her pace, weaving through pedestrians, glancing over her shoulder. The man mirrored her movements, always just far enough behind to be invisible to everyone else but her. Her heart pounded. She ducked into a narrow side street, thinking she could lose him, only to find herself trapped in a dead end. Looking for someone. The voice was low, smooth from behind her. She spun around. Patrick Byrne emerged from the shadows, collar turned up, cigarette unlit. Relief and anger collided in her chest. "Follow me," he said, tugging her arm gently but firmly. They moved quickly through a series of alleys, Patrick's knowledge of the streets allowing them to disappear from the watcher. Finally, he stopped at a small, dimly lit doorway, glancing at her. "You have no idea what's coming," he said quietly, eyes serious now, not the teasing glance she had grown used to. "And you've just stepped into it." Mary swallowed hard. I can't just walk away." Patrick studied her then for the briefest instant, something like respect flickered across his face. "You really don't know how dangerous this is. One wrong step and—" His words trailed off, the threat hanging heavy in the damp air. Mary nodded, determination hardening in her chest. She knew she was in over her head, but she also knew she wasn't turning back. Not now. Patrick exhaled slowly. "Then stay close, and stay quiet for your own good." The man in the overcoat, she realized, hadn't given up. He was still out there somewhere, just waiting. And Mary Porter understood, for the first time fully, that the game Patrick Byrne played was now part of her life, whether she wanted it or not. Through the smoke, she glimpsed him signaling to someone, a coded movement she couldn't understand. Then he glanced back at her, brief, sharp, warning, and disappeared into a side alley. Mary hesitated. Then she ran after him, knowing she shouldn't, knowing she was stepping further into a world where curiosity was deadly, and where Patrick Byrne was no longer just a man in the rain. By the time she reached the alley, the sounds of chaos were fading. A small group of men huddled near a doorway, whispering, eyes alert. Patrick leaned against the wall, calm as if nothing had happened, cigarette unlit now, hands in his pockets. "Mary," he said quietly, "you really shouldn't follow me." "I had to," she admitted, chest heaving. "I can't just forget." He studied her, unreadable, dangerous, and maybe, just for a moment, vulnerable. "And now you've seen enough to know why," he said. "This isn't a game. You step too close and you don't walk away, understand?" Mary swallowed hard. "I understand." But she didn't. Chapter 9, The Fire Within. Mary noticed it first in the quiet moments, the ones she told herself didn't matter, the pull behind her ribs, a warmth that rose and spread like ink in water. It wasn't pain, not exactly, and it wasn't pleasure either. It was something older, something that whispered through her veins when she was alone, when the rain had stopped and Dublin seemed to hold its breath. She caught herself staring at reflections in shop windows, thinking she saw flames flicker beneath her skin. At night, in her narrow room at Mrs. O'Shea's, the shadows cast by the candlelight seemed alive, writhing and coiling as though the city itself knew what had begun. She shook her head and told herself it was exhaustion, or the fog, or perhaps just the city pressing too close. But then came the dreams. Dublin smothered in smoke and fire, streets bending impossibly, the Liffey curling into shapes she had never seen. Faces appeared, unbidden, strangers with eyes that burned, mouths opening in silent screams. Sometimes Patrick was there, but never fully, a shadow in the corner, an echo of a glance, leaving her both comforted and frightened. She tried to ignore it. She worked harder at Trinity, buried herself in books, in case studies, in the endless annotations that her mind could cling to as proof that she was still normal. Yet every day she felt the pull stronger, tugging at her attention in ways she could not control. Sometimes a smell, smoke, iron, wet stone would make her flinch, her pulse quicken, and she would know, without knowing how, that danger hovered somewhere she could not see. By evening, Mary's hands would tremble, and she found herself reaching for the small bottle of whiskey she kept tucked in her satchel. Just a sip, she told herself, just to steady the edges. But the fire did not listen to reasoning. It surged, bright and impatient, curling around her thoughts, pressing her toward something she could not name. Chapter 10. The Unquiet Mind. The dreams grew louder. She saw doors she had never walked through, alleys that twisted impossibly, the familiar streets of Dublin dissolving into smoke and fire. Whispers followed her in the libraries, murmurs she could not trace to any source. Sometimes she woke from a nap with the taste of ash on her tongue, her fingers scorched in imagination. She drank more frequently, trying to dull the heat that rose in her veins, hoping that the burn would fade with each swallow. It never did. She learned to hide the tremor in her hands behind books, behind notes, behind the careful smile of a student who was overworked, overstimulated, perhaps just nervous. One afternoon, crossing Grafton Street, she froze. The vision hit her unbidden, a man, face indistinct, caught in flames on the cobblestones, the crowd parting, running, screaming. The glass of a shop window shattered in her dream, and moments later, somewhere not far away, a crash sounded, startling her and those around her. Her pulse raced. She felt the fire flare in response, a warning she could neither understand nor control. She retreated into the quiet corners of Trinity, scribbling observations in her notebook. The pages filled with sketches of faces, streets, symbols she did not recognize, and the word fire scrawled in margins over and over. She tried to convince herself it was coincidence. Logic, statistics, probability, anything that might anchor her to the world she knew. But each day the fire spoke louder, and each night the dreams returned with new intensity. And still she drank. The fire resisted, shimmering behind her eyes even as the liquid dulled her perception. She wanted to believe that sleep, whiskey, or distance from Patrick would keep it quiet, but deep in her chest, something told her it could not and would not be silenced. Chapter 11. Burning Veil. Mary began keeping a journal, filling page after page with observations, sketches, fragments of dreams. Some nights, she swore she saw symbols burned into the dark corners of her room, fading when she blinked. Others, she woke to the scent of smoke on her pillow, or the subtle heat of the fire coiling through her blood, impossible to ignore. An old folktale she stumbled across in Trinity's archives spoke of the blood that remembers.